Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for being here. We're going to get started. So as I've said, if you have a phone ringer on or anything else that might make noise, please go ahead and silence your devices. My name is Joe Jupil. I am an associate professor of political science here at the University of Colorado Boulder. Very pleased to welcome you here Monday, April 4th, panel 1715. EU sings, breaking up is hard to do. We have 4 panelists. I'll introduce them very briefly momentarily. But before I do, I see that there are microphones, but here in UMC 235, we have the possibility of receiving audience questions submitted via text. There's a trial format.
Joe, how do they do that if you've just asked everyone to turn their phones off?
That's why I said turn off your ringers. Note.
Okay.
In fact, if you've already, has anybody been using this already? Yeah, if you've been using this functionality, you should text leave so that it shuts down your previous session. And the idea, we're being live streamed, and so the idea of the text questions is to allow some of our online remote participants to be involved in the Q&A. So to participate in text question submission, you first need to join the session. And if you think you'd like to ask a question in this way, go ahead and take your phones out. But again, please take your, turn off your ringer. So to join this session, if you have your phones out and are ready, send a text message to 37607. So that is the recipient of the text message, 37607. And I think we have posters that illustrate this. Good. And you will get a confirmation message that you are now part of the session. And by replying to that message, you can submit your question for the panel. Now, if you're a CU Boulder student or a student of any sort, I suppose, please note this in your question so we can prioritize your question. If you'd like your first name and your location to be read aloud, please include this information in your text as well. If you don't have a cell phone, we have, again, microphones. And I think there are some index cards as well that might be available. And then when you're done at the end, I'll try to remind you at the end, text the word leave so that you close your session down. So, enough with the formalities. I wanted to introduce our panelists in the order in which they'll present. This will be standard CWA format. Each panelist will speak for 6 or 7 minutes. The panelists will then have an opportunity to respond to each other for a round or two, and then we will open it up to Q&A from everyone else. We'll begin with Reza Ramazani at the far side, far opposite side of the table from me, professor of economics at St. Michael's College in Vermont. He's a CU Boulder grad, and he showed me his bona fides because he has his cell phone wrapped in.
Go Buff!
Go Buffs, there we go. Good, yes. To my left, Alex Berzow is now a business manager of Recurrence, a startup in Seattle. And he and I share the distinction of having our PhDs from the University of Washington, so go Huskies, when they're not playing the bus. And he once swam in a volcanic blue lagoon in Iceland. Oliver Morton will go third. Senior editor of Essays and Briefings at The Economist in London, which I require my students to subscribe to. And he has an asteroid named after him, Oliver Morton 10716. And finally, last but not least, Srdja Popovic, who, thank you, who is the founder of the Center for Applied Nonviolent Action and Strategies in Belgrade, Serbia. And this may say more than having an asteroid named after you. I'm sorry, Oliver. He started a revolution in his early 20s. So, without further ado, Reza.
Good afternoon. It's always wonderful to come back home. And I gotta start saying that compared to the other panelists, I guess I have a home court advantage. So I apologize for that at the outset. I have only a few minutes, so I start with some introductory remark, and then hopefully during the question and answer, I will tell you about my position. Is it a good idea to break the EU, or is it too late? We need to make a few adjustments because it's going to be useful in the long run, given the current challenges, the problems EU is facing. So let me begin by saying the monetary union of the 19 countries, which we call it Eurozone, which was born in 1999, was a structurally flawed project. One more time, a structurally flawed project. This was an economic project designed politically to make Europe more united. Well, I got a positive reaction already. I don't need to read the next sentence. But instead, it's pulling Europe apart. Used to be 3 reasons, mainly economic reason. But seems like the past few months, we add a political reason. So let's start with some of the economic reason first. At the beginning, at the outset of creation of Euro, or EU in 1999, it was expected that the southern states or countries are going to act exactly like the northern states. In other words, Italy, in terms of economy, was supposed to act exactly like Germany. But it didn't work that way. It didn't work as they planned. And I hate to say it, instead, the Northern Europe forced to subsidize Southern European excess consumption, if I may use that term. And that causes a current account. And there is a great deal of resentment, and I can understand it, and I can relate it. Why Greeks, for example, making life miserable for the Chancellor of Germany? And all the name calling and comparing it to Hitler and so on and so forth. But I think when somebody is paying the bill, they might have a right to ask you how to spend it or how to behave. So this causes a balance of trade problem. The next problem is a fiscal problem, because we see a lot of countries, because of, again, excess consumption, they rely on the northern European countries to subsidize their expenditure, and that causes a fiscal problem. We see it. We saw it in Greece. We see it in Spain. We see it in Ireland. The next problem, so the first one was a balance of payment problem. The other one was fiscal problem. The next one is a banking problem, which unfortunately we see especially in Spain, now also in Ireland. Now, I think a lot of people underestimate this cultural, I like to call it the fact of a divergence of cultures. I think we try to do it very quickly, and we try to include some of the countries that were not ready to join this new club. In order for this club to be successful, we need the countries that maybe have similar economic, maybe similar culture, in order to make it very effective. So I think beside those 3 economic reasons, the balance of payment problem, the fiscal problem, the banking problem, we also have a monetary problem, because now all of them rely on a single currency. And that takes one of the economic tools in their toolbox when they are facing a certain economic crisis. For example, if Greece is experiencing a deficit in balance of payment, one of the economic tools in the toolbox is to devalue your currency in order to make your export much cheaper. But unfortunately, because most of this decision made by the Central Bank of Europe in Brussels, that tied the hand of some of the policymakers in those countries, especially a country like Spain, like Greece. But then, unfortunately, we need to add an additional challenge or problem beside those 4 economic problems that I just mentioned. And that's, as you know, is a migration problem. The fact that more than 1 million people now seeking asylum in Europe, and is a sudden influx of refugees. Some of them are refugees, but also some of them asylum seeker, but also are leaving their hometown, probably like me, for economic reason. So now we have a general idea as what are the challenges, both economic and political immigration challenge, that instead uniting Europe is doing the opposite, which is different from their goal or objective. So at this point, I want to stop, and it's nice to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Riza. Alex.
So I'm going to give a very quick overview. I'm not going to go over my time limit. I'm going to have 10 very quick reasons why the EU should fall apart, but 8 very good reasons why it won't, and I don't think that it will.
I thought that was my role, excuse me, as a two-handed economist.
So will the EU go on? So by the way, my connection with Europe is I do some European journalism, and my wife is European. We go back. I've been to Poland now 15 or 16 times, and so it's been fascinating watching European affairs from the perspective of Poland. So the euro crisis hasn't gone away. That's basically what's the gist of this. It's simply been eclipsed by the migrant crisis. That's what you're seeing on the news. But the fundamental underlying problem of the euro crisis hasn't gone away. It's exactly what Riza just said. There's a monetary union, but there's no common fiscal union. And so as a result, we still see countries like Greece that are still in trouble. In fact, there was a recent leak from the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, where a conversation between Angela Merkel and officials from the IMF were discussing terms of Greece's next payment for their bailout. And the IMF really doesn't want to do this unless Angela Merkel does a debt haircut, cutting some of the debt from Greece. Greek 10-year bonds, Reza can talk about this a lot better than I can, but Greek 10-year bonds are trading at 9%. That's really bad. Economists consider 7% to sort of be the threshold. So I mean, imagine getting a 10-year treasury note and getting 9, 10, 12% return on that. That's unheard of. Okay, well, there's a reason that's unheard of, because it's unsustainable. A government simply can't borrow money on those kinds of terms. So the other countries, though, Portugal, Ireland, Spain, they're doing better. And then I think, as we saw, there's no coherent foreign policy coming from the European Union. There are 28 states that all sort of have their own foreign policies, and there's nothing that's cogent or unified about their foreign policy. There are very few external border controls. Another big problem that The Economist often writes about is the insufficient democracy of the European Union, where the only elected body is the European Parliament, and everybody else is sort of appointed by diktat. And the European people feel that Brussels is sort of imposing their will on the rest of Europe without a legitimate democratic mandate. And then, of course, Oliver Morton is going to talk to us about the European Union minus the UK, if that were to come about. And then, of course, there's no common cultural identity between Europeans, not like Americans. There's not a lot of big difference between Oregonians and Washingtonians, but there is pretty big difference between Slovaks and British people. And so there's not a unifying culture that keeps Europe together. Now, those are all the reasons that I think Europe could fall apart, but here's why I don't think they will. Despite all of its troubles, countries still want to join. The Balkan countries, the former Yugoslav countries, they're all still wanting to join. The Eurozone is still expanding. Oh, actually, also including Turkey into that. They're not in the Balkans, but Turkey really wants to join the European Union as well. The Eurozone still expands. Despite all of its problems, Lithuania just adopted the euro, and 7 more countries are treaty bound to join the euro. So over the next 5-10 years, we're going to see an enlargement of the Eurozone. So in that way, the EU is sort of like the Hotel California, right? You can check in, but you can never really check out, right? And so Croatia just found this out too, because they just joined the European Union. And so breaking up is really hard work, okay? And what we have seen from the European Union is that Angela Merkel in particular doesn't like to make hard decisions head on. She would prefer to kick the can down the road. And that's sort of how the European Union muddles along. It gets through this because they don't want to make any big rattling changes. And so they kind of tend to muddle through. And I think that actually is going to work in their advantage for this. I think the European Union will stay together. Also, the European Union has brought a lot of peace and stability to a continent that traditionally didn't see a lot of it. And despite what some people think, the European Union has made the continent better off financially. Everybody's better off because of the barriers to trade being reduced. The Eastern Bloc gets a lot of money from Brussels. Poland, in particular, has been a very large beneficiary of European Union funding, grants, building infrastructure. And so I think that the Euro crisis has gone really from an acute phase to a chronic phase. And so, acute things tend to kill you. They're like heart attacks, right? But chronic diseases like cancer, it's not going to kill you right away. It's going to take a really long time. And so I think that's where we're kind of at with the Euro crisis. It could still be lethal if the problems are not addressed, but it's not going to surprise anybody anymore. Nobody's surprised that Greece is having more problems. So the markets aren't going to be rattled in the same way that they once were. And then, of course, the last thing is that despite the fact we live in the 21st century, we still have some common enemies. And I think that Russia serves as a nice reminder to the European Union that unity is better than being divided. And so I don't think the European Union will fall apart, despite all the problems. What I think might happen is that the northern Eurozone and the southern Eurozone might split because of things that Riza will have much more knowledge about than I do. But as a whole, the European project will survive.
Thank you. Oliver.
Thanks very much, Joe. Well, I'm British, but I'm also, and possibly primarily, a European, and that's the context I want to say this in. My godmother, Nesta Roberts, was the Guardian's, then the Manchester Guardian's Paris correspondent from about 1965 to 1975. And her book, The Face of France, has my copy of her book has a little dedication to me, saying to my godson Oliver, a first-generation European. I actually think of myself as a second-generation European. My father was one of the my father and mother met during the last great European war when they were both in the Royal Navy. In 1973, my father went and became one of the first British functionaries to work for what was then the European Commission, dealing with issues about North Sea oil. And so a young man who had been sinking U-boats in the North Atlantic ended his career and his life with some of his dearest friends being Germans, to whom he was deeply devoted. And that, I think, he was started off, I think, not as a very idealistic man, but the experience made him quite idealistic. I grew up in Brussels as a result, and there's a certain amount of Bismarck and sausage here. Being educated at a European school and growing up in Brussels, you do get a certain sense of the less idealistic parts of the European Commission. Being educated alongside children of other nationalities has largely the effect of reinforcing the stereotypes that you all hold about each other to begin with, because that's kind of what kids do anyway. But at the same time, it did leave me feeling idealistic to some extent about Europe, which I continue to feel. I think Europe will be a much better place with Britain in it, and that defines my position in the current political shenanigans in Britain. But I wanted to, because people find this idea of Britain's exit from the UK, or Brexit as it is abominably but necessarily known, So I find from outside rather confusing. And the only major leader of a third-party nation who's in favour of Brexit, and this goes slightly to Alex's last point, is Vladimir Putin. Other people, including other people in what's sometimes called the Anglosphere, the leaders of the Anglosphere, are all united in thinking that Britain would be foolish to leave the UK. However, there is now a real chance that that will happen. And one of the things that's very striking about this debate, one is that it's actually taking place very largely within one political party and persuasion. And certainly is the way it's presented in the British media, this is very much a debate between two different types of conservatism. The type of conservatism that doesn't much like Europe but feels it should stay in, and the type of conservatism that doesn't much like Europe and thinks it should get out. And this makes the whole tenor of the debate rather inimical to anything remotely idealistic. And so does, the current state of Europe. It's not, for those of us who feel that there's something important there, seeing a paranational organization which is participating in the immiseration of some at the behest of others, not a pleasant thing. But the thing about the British debate, and this goes to, I think, the deeper core, is that Alex was saying that there's not a common cultural conception of what it is to be European. It's fairly clear from, and we've been a political and economic union for 305 years or so, 310 years in the United Kingdom. We don't seem, judging by the Brexit debate, to have a common cultural conception of what it is to be British. In that there are some people who think it's a very important part of being British that we should be Europeans, and there are some people who think it's a very important part of being British that we should not be Europeans. By and large, of the 4 constituent parts of the United Kingdom, 3 of them are very keen on continuing to be members of the European Union. The Scots have always talked about the old alliance with France. The Scots are quite keen Europeans. For the Northern Irish, the European Union is particularly vital because it's the bedrock on which their peace with the Southern Irish is built. And both the institutions of the European Union and the European Court of Human Rights are absolutely fundamental to bringing peace to Ireland. The Welsh, my father's nation, and not that anyone else, even in the UK, really cares, but the Welsh are fairly strongly pro-European. It's the English, unfortunately the English are 85% of us, who have this division. But the English division, and it is a cultural division, it's very strongly seen. If you look at various markers, political markers in the UK, that some of them work very well and some of them don't. For instance, you will find far more readers of The Guardian, a liberal newspaper, are conservative voters than are interested in leaving Europe. Vice versa, you will find that quite a lot of readers of The Sun, a right-wing tabloid, in fact vote Labour, but they are also all very interested in leaving Europe. So there is a very strange set of fault lines, and I think part of them can be traced to the idea that the Exiters, the outists, want to re-establish a Britain that never really was, because they want to establish a Britain, a largely English, but to some extent truly British polity, that is neither European nor imperial. And there is a massive, thank you, and there is a disconnect in the imagination about what it is to be an independent nation, because Britain was an imperial power, and then it was a part of Europe, and the few decades in between were not among our finest. And this is where we get back to the idealistic part of it. What is it to try and be a nation that is part of something greater but is still a nation? Europe is trying to have that debate more deeply and profoundly than any other part of the world, I think. It brought the world the modern nation state in the Treaty of Westphalia. It is now negotiating ways to move beyond that. It is doing in some ways very poorly, but that's a process which I wish to continue to be part of. Thank you.
Wonderful, thank you. Sergio.
Okay, first, when I've seen my name on this panel, I thought it is because I'm coming from one of the countries that, despite all the funny things that are happening in Europe, desperately want to join Europe. And I was leading a movement against the butcher of Balkans, Milosevic, which was based on the fact that we need to remove this guy in order to get back our European identity. It was only later when I come to this table that I start thinking that it's maybe because I gave a lecture on St. Michael's College that I'm quoting Real Clear Politics every time I need to sound like an expert on a Serbian TV regarding American elections, and because I'm always carrying a copy of The Economist. It's, well, you know, it's like I was never a big fan of conspiracy theories, but here it works fine. Glad to be in Boulder. I'll like the guys who know much more about these things than me. I'll just look it from the point of the battlefield, and from somebody who is involved in training movements on how to expand their political and social space. You always start by mapping the battlefield. So you see the things which are pro-status quo, as you said, and the things which are against status quo. And I see the 5 group of things which are kind of endangering Europe. I will start with one which is the most present in media, which is the refugee crisis. I had a marvelous conversation with a great woman who is hosting me this morning, and find her shock when I say I don't believe in this because this is crap. We are talking about the 500 million people who need to host 2 million people. You guys are accepting more Chinese immigrants in the United States every single year. My little country called Serbia accepted 300,000 refugees only during Milosevic's war, and we are 7 million. And we survive. Look at us. There are 500,000 Syrians and Afghanis and Libyans passing through our territory in the last year and a half, 100,000 of them still sitting within our borders. No problems, no fences. So it's doable. It's like the first time I can be proud on the thing that the Serbs have done is this refugee crisis. Of course, as somebody who is very involved in nonviolent movements, I think the real salvation in this problem lies in long-term solving the Middle East crisis. And as somebody passionate about the nonviolent struggle, there is a great statistics. Do you know how many people in this refugee waves are coming from the countries which has a violent uprising followed by a foreign military intervention? Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, 2 out of 3. So forget about solving problems with the planes and bombs and boots on the ground. It's not solving the problems, it's creating more problems. Second thing, which Alex pointed so well, I'm not going to elaborate, is this structural crisis. Part of Europe is tired of expansion and tries to keep the damn dirty neighbors from Balkans and Turkey out. Another part is still finding its identity and whether we are Europeans or not. But the funny thing is that you guys don't understand by living in the United States, and I travel this country a lot. If I move here, and in fact I have plans to move to Colorado, so be afraid. Be very afraid. I would probably not having much troubles from where I'm coming from, except everybody teasing me for how to pronounce my name or my funny Russian-sounding accent. And my kid, who is 2 years now, would probably grown up into the full American. You people are the nation of immigrants. My grandchildren would be treated as the Serbs in a country like Germany, or grandchildren in a country like Switzerland. So it's a mental problem we need to tackle. Of course, the one very dear to my heart is the rise of illiberalism. Europe was based on the values. Part of these values are freedoms and democracy. Look at who is running Hungary. Look at who is running Poland. Look at who is in the parliament in Slovakia. We're talking about the people whose rhetorics and populism and intolerance is not something European values should tolerate, or at least they should punish or find a way to tackle these trips when they're happening. There are so many numerous examples, I can discuss them later, but these guys are a real plague in Europe, because if we leave Orbans of this world go mainstream in Europe, then we are underfounding the very values on which European Union was built upon. Second is, of course, the crisis of mainstream political parties. You want to look at the Great Britain and UKIP, you want to look at Marine Le Pen in France, you want to look at Syriza in Greece, you will find that something is rotten within existing political parties. I normally love political outsiders. All the great nonviolent revolutions, including the one in Serbia, came from the political outsiders. But political outsiders or hobbits step in when the normal political elite is tired and disconnected with the people. Any connection with a guy with funny hair you talk too much these days about is very intentional. So, of course, the last one, which I wouldn't undermine, because I'm living in a country where they're investing a lot of efforts and they're super successful in building a personality cult, is Putin ante portas, or the bear in front of your door. We have Russia that needs unstable Europe. We have Russia which desperately needs crisis abroad to mask the problems they have at home. Do you want to look at how much money Marine Le Pen party is getting from the Sberbank, or what's the name of this Russian national bank which funds it? So you want to look at every single guy who is trying to spoil European peace, you'll find some kind of ideological or financial connection to Russia. I don't think it's imaginary enemy. I think the situation from Maidan grew into Putin's head, into his obsession, and he's now envisioning the Cold War, which is becoming more and more the reality in some countries. Try being anti-Russian in my country and you will see what the right-wing nationalists will do to you. And they're doing to me and my organization every single week. So of course, what may be the solutions, which will be the main topic of this panel. On one hand, where is the unity and vision among European leaders and among the Western world to go back to the values? Because I think this is the very important thing, building on values as opposed to building on bureaucracy. And also, what can be done to encourage the hobbits? Hobbits are everywhere. You have anti-immigrant demonstration in Germany, immediately the pro-immigrant demonstration came in. You have the Sons of Odin, the guys who are marching in black uniforms in places like Finland and Sweden. Immediately the cool guys dressed as clowns come in and mock them off. So can we train these people to be more efficient, or we will just leave it to the populists and right-wing nuts? It's a big question for every country in Europe. Thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. So thank you all very much, and thank you for keeping to time and nevertheless making substantive and provocative remarks. So what I'd like to do is go back through the panel to respond to each other in the order in which you originally presented. So just short comments, and as much as you can engage the remarks of the other panelists, the better it would be. So thank you. Reza.
Yeah, at the beginning of my talk, I play the Prince of Gloom and Doom, and I talk about all the economic and political problems that the EU is facing. But at the same time, we have to look at the positive things, and that's what economists do usually. They look at the cost versus the benefit, before they make the decision. When we look at some of the economic problems, comparing it to other countries like United States, for example, when we look at the size of the debt in Europe, is not really as bad as the one we have in the United States, because the size of the debt compared to the gross domestic product, or GDP, is only 87%. In this country, the size of the debt compared to GDP is more than 100%. And in this country, some people might argue that we have a problem with the banking system, which by far is worse than what is happening in Europe, and that's being too big to fail. Now, the banking system in Europe are not too big, maybe too big for some particular countries. So what I see, as a major problem that really give ammunition to the right wing that my colleague, mentioned too, and the sense of nationalism in Europe, is a problem. Europe is struggling. The government of many of these European countries are struggling to take collective decision. Yes, they have the same monetary union, but their fiscal policy is different. And when it comes to making a political decision, they do not work together in order to coordinate a same or similar policy. So I think, one way, and giving all the gloom and doom about Europe, what is going on, I think we have to be very careful not breaking down breaking up Europe, it doesn't make any economic and political sense because they spend a lot of time, a lot of money, and I don't think it's a good idea, for Europe, to go back to the drawing board or to break up. So, and then going back to the question of what is happening in Europe in terms of an increase in nationalism and right wing, I think is a movement, I hate to say it, is unfamiliar with as an immigrant. And again, I'm not surprised and I'm not upset, I'm not angry as I used to be in the past. We talk about people with a bad hairdo looking for a scapegoat. They blaming every single problem in this country to Mexican or the Chinese. And with all due respect, it reminds me as a Persian, as an Iranian, after the revolution happened in Iran. Because the mullahs in Iran blame every single problem to the big Satan, the United States. Even if it was a natural disaster in Iran, such as earthquake, they blame the big Satan. And I think some people in this country, and definitely some people in Europe, doing exactly the same thing. They blaming the immigrant, they blaming the foreigners for all the problems. And I hate to say that. I think maybe some of the immigrant, they give a great deal of ammunition, to the opposition, especially based on what happens in Germany recently when some young Arab man attacked some of the women. And my own wife, who is from Germany, I think is a little bit nervous, a little bit scared when the chancellor allow all of this immigrant to come to our country without establishing a system of check and balances.
Thank you. Alex.
Well, the latest poll, I was just sitting over here looking it up, is 43% of British people want out of the European Union, 39% want to stay, and 18% say I don't know. Dick Morris, who was a political analyst, is fond of saying that if you ask someone that they're married, are you going to be in your marriage next year? And they say, I don't know. It's not a good sign, right? So I have a fundamental faith, though, that the pro side will win in the in the UK to stay in the European Union, but it didn't help with some of the big names that came out against it, like Boris Johnson, the mayor of London. Now, going on to what Reza was talking about in nationalism, I think that populism in all of its forms is really bad. Left-wing populism and right-wing populism. We're seeing both in the UK. In the form of Nigel Farage being in charge of the UKIP, which is a nationalist right-wing populist party, and then Jeremy Corbyn, who's sort of taken over the Labour Party, left-wing populist. Same thing is happening here in the United States with Bernie Sanders leading the left-wing populist charge and Donald Trump leading the right-wing populist charge. So I always take the view that populism is always bad. It rarely yields good policy. But right-wing populism in particular tends to be a little scarier. And that's just because of the ties to nationalism, and that doesn't always end well, right? So I don't think the U.S. is going to be immune from this trend. I think Europe is sort of leading the charge on this. I think there's sort of this global backlash against globalization. People who feel marginalized by globalization, feel left out of global economic progress, are taking out their anger on people in charge. And I think that largely explains this, but I do think it will go away. I think we're kind of in a phase, and it will hopefully go away over time.
Thank you very much. Oliver.
I want to come back on a few things that Alex said. I want to actually come back on what Alex just said, which was I think it's slightly hard for me to understand Jeremy Corbyn as a left-wing populist. Jeremy Corbyn's just left-wing. He's an old-fashioned 1970s socialist of the sort that there's still quite a lot of in the Labour Party, and that's who they vote for. He's not a populist. He's not popular. He's not going to win. But I don't think that. But I think it slightly confuses things, and I think we're too keen sometimes to say, well, there's this happening on the left and this happening on the right, so they're in some ways balanced. I don't think there's very little in common between the appeal of Nigel Farage, such as it is, and that of Jeremy Corbyn, such as it is. But I wanted to come back. There was a point earlier about lack of democracy in Europe, and I understand this point, but I also think that it's somewhat, and it's a real issue, but it's also a somewhat occluded issue in that the governments of Europe, which are democratically formulated, tend to decide on the big things that happen in Europe. They then tend to deny that they've done so when they don't like what happens back at home, and they say, oh, Europe made us do this. You were there in the room, you were part of the decision, and this leads to the bigger problem of representation, I think, which is Europe is felt to some extent accurately to be an elite project. In almost all European countries, the elite is likely to be more pro-European than the mass of the people. In Norway, which is not a member of the EU, the elite is very pro-European. The rest of the people won't allow them to join the EU, and so the elite takes a perverse statistic joy in enforcing EU regulations on Norway more stringently than anywhere else, just to punish the people for not being part of the European Union. Nevertheless, Norway is a lovely country, and I wish it I wish it well in all its endeavours. But going back to the point about populism, I think this is an important point. This is actually brought up by, I'm not necessarily here to talk my own book, but a very nice article by my colleague Jeremy Cliff in last week's Economist. We're talking about the very declining fortunes of European social democracy. It's important to remember that the European Union is shaped, though not truly formed, in the era of European politics that Tony Judt so beautifully wrote about in his book Post-War. And it's a world in which the political possibilities of Europe are trapped between the real existing threat of the Soviet Union on one side and the closely remembered threat of fascism on the other side. And that provided a European politics which, I think this is the term Tony used, which huddles in the center. A politics of centre-right and centre-left and of great... And things that are now sayable in European politics that were simply not sayable or sellable a generation ago in 1989. And to some extent, that's real progress, because it's much better for us that we no longer feel trapped in that way, but at the same time, without some sort of corrective, and I love the idea of young people in direct action being that corrective. Incidentally, in Britain, one of the greatest, best indicators whether someone is pro-Europe or is pro-leaving or pro-staying is simply her or his age. The young people of Britain are resolutely in favour of a European future. If people's votes on Europe in Britain were weighted by the number of years they can look forward to living in it, the majority for staying in the European Union would be overwhelming.
Fascinating. Thank you.
These are great comments, and I would just go on this. I completely agree with both Alex and Oliver on this. And I mean, it's like as somebody who is coming from I'm a great fan of two British geniuses. One is Tolkien and his Lord of the Rings, and this idea that even the smallest creature can change the destiny of the world. And if you watched or read Lord of the Rings, you will understand that it was not the people in the shiny armors or the wizards who were important, e.g. elites, but the hobbits, laid-back, cool people with big, hairy feet who love to eat, drink, and smoke pot. So when you look at how to empower these people, you will see that the stability of every system, and we knew it from Serbia. You want to look at the nationalist elites in Balkans that made this wrong decision that somehow getting in war with each other will keep them in power, and that led to the 10 years of absolutely senseless bloodshed. And millions of refugees and war crimes. I mean, you name it, you have it. And then you look at the way as the foreign elites were trying to solve it with the military and with the sanctions and with the clumsy court in Hague, and it wasn't really working. And then the group of hobbits came together in Serbia, and it was the nationally led youth movement that succeeded, in which Blair and Clinton and others failed. So it's like I'm a true believer in this idea of empowerment of the people. And when you look at every stable system anywhere in the world, and this is now the Fletcher theory, I'm not a political scientist at all, though they allow me to teach in Harvard. Don't let them know, they will kick me out. But basically it's like you want to have a stable society, you need strong institutions, but you also need citizens that are aware and keeping their governments accountable. If you don't have active citizens, any government will turn into illiberalism, because if people do not oppose, politicians will exploit on it. This is the nature of the political beast. And I know this. I spent years in parliament and the government, so I'm talking about myself as well. And the last but not of least importance, I think this is, we want to look at it as a world trend. And we want to look at it not only as a crisis of the social democracy, but basically the crisis of values, or the answer to the losers of globalization. But this, nothing is real and everything is possible, which is the name of the very good book wrote by Peter Pomerantsev about the new Russia, and how the combination of the strongmanism and the tabloidization of everything and reality show is basically shaping the Russian politics. And you want to look at the Trump, and you can see the very, very strong connection to this, is how we can stop this phenomenon. And the only way to stop this phenomenon is to mobilize people around values. Yes, young people, yes, common people. And yes, we need the strong elites to fight against it. But sorry to say, I don't see strong elites anywhere in Europe. And aside Merkel, I don't see a strong leader anywhere in Europe. But I do see a lot of the clever people and young people who are understanding that this is poisonous. And this is not only poisonous to Europe's future, it's poisonous for their country's future. It's poisonous for the West civilization as we know it. So we need to focus more on finding the good guys and equipping them with tools, with keeping populations active. And only then, then we can talk about courting the right-wing nuts, except of sitting on our little castles of sand and saying, oh, the Trump is coming, Marine Le Pen is coming, the Putin is coming. We need to act.
Okay, thank you very much.
Who's the other bit as well as talking? You said two.
So I would like to go ahead and open. I'd like to go ahead and open things up to Q&A. So if you have a question that you'd like to pose, yeah, please come on forward and I guess you identify yourself and ask your question. Yes, sir.
My name is Oli Fodder. I don't think the mic is working, but I think my voice is up.
Yeah, it was.
Oh, it is, okay.
Yeah.
I have several questions that I would like you to maybe expand a little bit on. We have the European Union, we have the Monetary Union, we have the Schengen Accord, and you could throw in NATO. All of these are European issues, and I was wondering if you could give us a little bit more detail on each one of them and where you think they're going. Thanks.
Okay. And we have a question from the text line here that I would just add in, which is a question about, I think what the Europeans would call variable geometry. So, what are the possibilities of an EU in which members pick and choose different aspects of membership, maybe yes to the security part, no to the single currency, yes to the single market, et cetera, in various individual mixes. So who would like to take either of those questions? Reza?
I take the first part of the question and say a few things about the monetary union or a single currency. And I think that aspect of the policy overall, again, same as before, I hate to say it has pluses and minuses, and that was to reduce the uncertainty and to reduce the risk by making sure all of these countries is using the same currency and reduce a lot of risk. It make, when the consumer in Europe purchasing a product, she or she doesn't have to spend a lot of money exchanging one currency to another. So it was very efficient. It made a lot of economic sense. And I think that was the very important aspect of having a single currency. But the problem is, when you have a single currency, you are taking, as I said earlier, you're taking one of the most important tools to correct some of the potential economic problem out of the toolbox. And the single currency work as long as more or less the countries have same economic condition. And in order to become a member of this monetary union and use the same currency, there was some prerequisite. For example, we had to make sure that the ratio of the debt to GDP is at a certain level in order to become a member of this exclusive club. But unfortunately, because of a political reason, we didn't really follow all the rule and regulation before you become a member. We are rushing, to increase the number as quickly as we can. And I think that probably backfired and created a lot of resentment, I think, in a lot of countries in the southern part, because this is what I see as a problem with the single currency. In the US, we come up with the expansionary or contractionary monetary policy. The Federal Reserve System want to increase or decrease money supply, which might be appropriate for every single state in the western, in the Midwest, or in the eastern part of the country. But the problem when you have almost 19 countries with the different economic programs, when the Central Bank of Europe making a monetary decision, either increase or decrease the money supply, that policy might be appropriate for Germany, but not might be appropriate for Greece or Spain. And I think that's what I see as the biggest challenge of using a single currency. I let my colleagues answer the other two parts of your question.
Very good. I see Alex looks like he has a good chart here to refer to.
Yeah, so this is in regard to the second question, I think, which is sort of, does Europe have this sort of buffet of options that countries can pick and choose which laws that they want to sign up for and which ones they want to ignore? And the answer is yes, that's what the European Union currently is. The UK has opted out of the Eurozone. They have opted out of the Schengen Agreement. Switzerland, I believe, they're not a part of the Eurozone, but they're in Schengen. Norway,
They're not part of the union.
but they're not part of the union. That's correct. And so, and Norway's not a part of the union, but they choose to apply the laws, or part of Schengen. And so, yes, that already exists, and yes, that's a point of contention, because what the worry is that you're going to have what they call a two-speed Europe, or a two-tier Europe, where the Eurozone countries, the countries that are actually on the euro, are going to make all the decisions for the European Union, and the countries that are not a part of the euro are kind of sitting on the outside looking in. And so that has been a concern about the future of the European Union. I would imagine, and correct me if I'm wrong, that future countries are probably going to have fewer options. They're probably going to have to pick they're going to have to take everything. It's not going to be a smorgasbord or buffet that they can pick from.
Well, I mean, that's very much part of, that's part of the context in which the Brexit debate is being seen in Brussels and the other capitals of the Union, because the more Britain gets away with having had a minor renegotiation of its own status, the more people think that other people will be wanting to do that. And that's also one of the reasons, incidentally, why if Britain votes to leave the European Union, things will go very nasty very quickly, because the idea that that it is like the Hotel California is quite important to various sorts of ratcheting. And the actual treaty obligations, the treaty set up for someone trying to leave the European Union is basically, you put in the marital, the Dick Morris marital image, it's basically like saying, well, I want a divorce, okay, well then the other party gets to make all the decisions about what happens next. That's what Article 50 of the Lisbon Treaty says. So Britain says we want to leave, and the rest of your EU says, okay, well, here are the conditions, and there's no negotiating on it. That could be really, really, really ugly. The other thing is, of course, NATO is, although mostly European, it's very far from uniquely European, since Canada, Turkey, and the United States are all members in pretty good standing. And that comes to the question of, and I think it's really in Chapter 5 of the NATO Treaty that the issues with the issues that Sergej brought up with Putin are going to come to a head.
Sergej, I wanted to ask you, is there appetite, what's the appetite in Serbia for drinking from the fire hose in terms of coming into the EU and having to accept all of the obligations of membership?
Well, it was bigger in 2000, straight after the removal of Milosevic, but then we have this feeling that somehow we are left apart, and then with all the pressuring, which deals with the breakaway part of the country, which is called Kosovo, which was admitted by some countries like UK and US, and not admitted by others, and so on and so on. Still, it's very strong. Still, it's around 50% of the people. And I think it's a trend in which we think that, adopting these norms will solve our problems. But in the same time, you can see the Russian sentiment growing, and the millions invested in propaganda and right-wing groups are paying back. So there will be a clash very soon between, you know, where to go, to the east or to the west. And of course, all the troubles with European Union, especially the Brexit thing, is not helping the topic at all. So yes, I mean, it's like what we really need I mean, I can speak as a representative of my people in this case, is we don't see whether the Europe wants this expansion or no. And we don't see the clear reasons why, for example, some countries which joined NATO were put on a fast track to the European Union, and some countries which were filling more and more obligations are not put into it. And then you see immediately, of course, there is a deal with refugees, so let's reopen the chapters in Turkey, the country which has more arrested journalists than Iran and Saudi Arabia combined. I mean, so it's like when you look at the values and you put the politics on the top of the values and you want to judge it, you know, it's like speaking about the media freedoms and basically the human rights, Serbia is doing far better than Hungary now.
Right.
And still Hungary doesn't get punished. So it's like when you're looking at these criteria, they are sometimes very blurry. The more blurry they are, the lower the numbers of the people who want to join. It's clear like that.
Riza?
That's what I see, I think, as a really major problem, because we are not treating all the countries as a part of the EU exactly the same. And as my colleague mentioned, I think we are cherry picking. And the reason, I might be wrong, but the reason Turkey and some of the Balkan countries are willing, you know, to become a part of the EU is because they feel probably there is something for them to gain. And my question is, why most of these are a weaker country that they want to become a part of the EU? Because maybe we're giving some of this country an incentive based on what is happening right now, that the northern countries in Europe are willing to subsidize our consumption. Or we are rewarding a misbehavior by allowing, again, you know, some of these Balkan countries or Turkey to become part of the EU. And unfortunately, based on a couple of the bad apples, you know, as part of the immigrant who went to Germany and other part of Europe, unfortunately, I see a great deal of resentment now. And some of the countries are now willing to accept any immigrant, especially the educated one, the very productive one. And that's, I think, something that I feel is a major problem at this point.
I just wanted to add to what Sergio had just said was that, you know, Hungary has been violating many of the rules of the European Union with absolutely no punishment whatsoever. And that the exact opposite is now happening in Poland, where the new right-wing government, PiS, Law and Justice Party under Jarosław Kaczynski is sort of this conspiratorial right-wing government. They believe that the Russians killed their last president. I mean, there's a long list of craziness that follows this party around. And they are now being investigated by the European Commission. And so part of what Sergio just said was the unfairness of why is it that Hungary is not being investigated? Why are they not being sanctioned? Whereas Poland is now, the first time ever, the European Commission has launched a justice, sort of a law and justice inquiry into the state of Poland and the state of democracy in Poland. Now, I think they deserve it. But there has certainly been an inconsistency in rules being applied across the European Union.
I fully agree with that. I think, though, one has to accept that there's something of a tension between one of the lines of opposition to the European Union is that it makes everyone exactly the same and doesn't take account of national differences. And then, of course, it does take account of national differences in ways that we don't like. And you know, it's very, very hard. How monolith? I mean, it is clear, and you know, it's become most clear in Monetary Union. You can't fashion from 24 independent nations a monolith in a short while. But what sort of account do you have to take for residual differences and deep-seated cultural differences? It's very, very hard to do. I don't for a moment think that the leaders of Europe are doing it right at the moment, but I do also acknowledge it's incredibly, you know, there are so many different political factors that come into sway in, you know, what you do to Poland and what you do to Hungary. But yes, I would obviously, in large ways, want to bash them both.
I'm wondering if there is some sort of Poland is sort of the poster child of Eastern Europe because the economy has really grown, the infrastructure has really grown, and they were kind of seen as this success story of, and I'm wondering if the bullwhip is being cracked on them because it's kind of like tough love, which is Hungary is still kind of lost with Viktor Orban, but Poland, you guys were really who we were putting our hopes in, and now you're turning the wrong way. And I'm wondering maybe that has something to do with it.
And maybe the fact that in Poland you have the meaningful nationwide opposition to the government
Yes,
also helps. So you have this pressure from below.
And the president
which
of the
is very
European
awful.
and the president of the European Council is Donald Tusk. the
Yes,
president-
yes.
former president.
Whose party is prosecuted for the same airplane thing?
Yeah.
But when you look at Hungary, the alternative is worse.
Right,
The
Jobbik.
second largest party in Hungary is the right-wing nuts that Marine Le Pen cannot envision. The Jobbik, the people who are marching in black uniforms, they're 25% of the vote.
Yeah, too right wing for Marine Le Pen.
Yeah, right and righter.
Please go on, Oliver. Yeah.
I was just thinking from my own experience in Brussels, there is this issue also. I mean, there was a European extreme right that, for various reasons, was somewhat hidden after the Second World War. But, in the 1930s, a large part of, not a majority, but a large part of the Flemish people were voting for the Rexists, who were, and there is, there's a long, hard to address issue of there being a hard far right in Europe, and
Horthy in Hungary.
yeah, Hungary is, the quintessence.
So I want to, again, encourage audience members to come up if you have any questions for the panel. Looks like we'll have one over here. Yeah, very good. Yes, sir.
The first part of my question is directed at Oliver. Do you think the U.S. or President Obama in particular could play a role in influencing British voters to not exit the EU? And secondly, does the U.S. have a responsibility to try and influence the EU to stay together?
So
The question was, can President Obama influence Britain, and does the U.S. have an obligation, was it, to... And I think the U.S. has an interest, and I think nations by and large have interest more than anything else. The U.S. definitely has an interest in having a consolidated European partner. I think that at the margins, that 18% of undecideds, allegedly in the most recent opinion polls, will probably listen to what President Obama says. He's a pretty popular kind of guy in our country, and indeed increasingly in yours. I notice his favourables have gone up something like 11% recently. It's not bad. And there is anyway, so when this is talked about, of course, the outist right say, and with some justification, that the US would never sanction the sort of sacrifices of sovereignty that it takes to be in the European Union, and that is, of course, correct. And the US won't sanction the sort of sacrifice of sovereignty that are required in signing into the Convention on the Law of the Sea. So, yeah, free movement of people is not something that's going to happen here. But I think I can see that there are differences, but I think in general, I tend to think that the British people mostly think that President Obama is an interesting guy and will listen to what he has to say. I don't think it will really sway very many people, but I don't think it will. I don't think there'd be, if the burden of your question was, would there be a backlash? I don't think that particularly either.
I totally agree with that, and it's nice to find out that a lot of Americans realize what a wonderful president we had, and I think at least a lot of us going to miss him, and I think, the history is going to judge him, I think, much more fairer than we have done it in the past. So I want to look at it from economic point of view. I think a strong Europe is not only good for United States, I believe is good for every single country, both developed and developing countries. Not only from economic point of view, but as some of my colleagues mentioned, also for political stability in this vital world. So I hope the British decide to stay, because in the long run, I think it's not only good for them, good for other countries involved, including the United States.
Up until this point, I think I agreed with absolutely everything my co-panelists had said, except for this one point. I don't think that Europeans particularly care what President Obama thinks or what Americans think. I travel there a lot, and when I watch the news, I never hear a politician say, gee, if only we know what Uncle Sam's opinion was on this. I don't think they particularly care. I think that European Union affairs are seen as European Union affairs, and external meddling, I'm not sure it will be looked favorably upon, to be honest.
It'll be interesting to see, because I believe the visit is actually going to happen. So it'll be interesting to see. I think that in general that might be right. I think that there's a respect for the measured, thoughtful tones of your president that people do actually listen to. I mean, I don't think that would necessarily play. I wouldn't recommend it in France. And there's probably a parlor game to be played of things one wouldn't recommend in France. But I do think that in Britain, I think it'll be marginal. I don't think there'll be a huge backlash. I don't think people will sort of like jump up and down and say, how dare he say this, just not least because he's not going to say it in a stupid way.
Very good. Yes, we have a question over here. Can you come to the mic? Yes.
I have a question regarding Turkey, and what I'm trying to understand or better understand is what is in it for them now. I understand why they wanted to be part of the Union years ago, but now is it still, really vital for them to pursue that? Does anyone know?
Being from Iran, I think, this has been a long dream of Turkey to become a part of Europe. Because I think Turkey doesn't like to be compared with the countries with its neighbor, in Asia. They always, there might be some truth in that they feel they belong to Europe, than belong, to those countries like Iran and other. And I think here, this is a great, opportunity for Turkey finally achieve its dream and becoming part of Europe. And I hate to say it, the economic incentive. Now we're trying to speed up the process, but we are bribing the Turkish government. We're saying, look, there is a possibility, but speed up the process, make you a member of EU. However, you gotta take back a lot of these refugees. So there is a condition to speed up the process.
Can I give you a blunt geopolitical overview? And I'm subjective here. I'm not a big fan of Erdogan. I think he's doing the worst job in the world in degrading the quality of this country. I think he's not going to last long because unlike rich oiled countries, the Turkey relates on human capital. And the numbers of the people who are producing the real wealth of Turkey is sick of Erdogan. So this is my projection for the future. He went from somebody who was selling a dream of a combination of democracy and mostly Muslim country, which was how Turkey operated after 3, 4, 5, 6 years of his reign, getting into the phase when every single move was turned into disaster. So he needs Europe now because every single adventure he was turned badly. He supported Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. He was overwhelmed by military and Emirates and Qataris, so he doesn't have friends there. He thought he will be instrumental in kicking out Assad in Syria. It didn't really work. He thought that he will be capable of getting as a regional player there and getting into the proxy between Iran and Saudis on Syria. He failed miserable. So now he's surrounded by enemies. He even went to bed with Putin on Turkish stream at some point, which didn't really last long. These two guys are very much alike, coming from my vision. And they would do anything abroad just to save their popularity at home. And at the end, he failed in creating himself the Sultan of Turkey. That was the reason he went from prime minister to the president, was to create a supermajority that will help him get whatever internal mandate. He even built the biggest palace in the world to prepare for this. Unfortunately for him, AKP didn't do that well. And they lost elections in June. The only way to reignite his power was to start internal war with Kurds. So now he's surrounded with enemies. He's having almost a civil war within Turkey. He's not having a popular support than he had. So I think the last doors he can knock are the doors of European Union. That's a different, but I'm not a fan of him, so I'm not objective at all.
We have some questions from the text lines. I'm looking at a few of them. One of them is the mirror image of the question that we just got, which is what's in it for Turkey. And this one asks, why is the EU still accepting new countries while it is in such flux? So what is the reasoning behind support for enlargement, or where do things stand in terms of continued further expansion of the EU from the current 28 over 30 and beyond?
Well, I think largely it has to do with security and stability on the continent. A lot of the countries that haven't yet entered the European Union are the Balkan countries. Serbia is still not in the European Union, for instance. And it was just sort of a foregone conclusion that the Balkans would at some point enter into the European Union. That was not a question. It was a matter of when, not if. And I think the same sort of applied to the Baltic states. They wanted to be a part of the European Union because they have a big hungry bear as their neighbor, and they wanted to join the European Union and NATO as well. And so I think it's driven largely by stability.
And there's also, I mean, the idea of sort of like why does Europe just not quit? I mean, I think Raven made the good point. There is actually something that the European elites can say, look, this is still a project that people want to join. That has a certain psychological value in and of itself. I mean, my own feeling is that it will be a very, very, very long time before Turkey joins. But the idea of just increasing the numbers, it helps to make Europe look popular. It doesn't do anything to solve any of the structural problems.
I think I totally agree. I look at it probably from the cynical point of view. I think that provides a great deal of ammunition to Mrs. Merkel and other government in Europe that the sky is not falling. Given the fact that we have all these economic and political problems, how come a lot of other countries, they want to join the club? So I think that's probably a good point.
So if anyone from the audience would like to come up and pose a question, it looks like there is no line, no waiting. Here we have one coming up, so. Yes, thank you.
Yeah, this feels a little bit like the elephant in the room. Wouldn't you say that one of the great motivations of forming the European Union was to keep Germany in check? And if they want to keep Germany in check, it would be counterintuitive to break it up.
Yes, and that was economic and political unity was the driving motivation behind the European Union, making sure that everybody got along politically, and the way you make sure that occurs is by making sure everyone gets along economically. Hasn't worked out entirely as planned. But yes, that was the motivating factor behind it. Germany, you will see, is probably the most pro-European country because they feel this sort of national guilt toward maintaining a peaceful continent, which is why Merkel really doesn't like being too proactive, I think, in her policy decisions because she doesn't want to have people painting, Hitler mustaches on her in Greece. Yeah. And so, yes, the Germans are particularly well aware of that elephant in the room, and I think that if the EU were to fall apart, which I don't think it will be, it'll be over the protestations of Germany, ironically enough.
Yeah, and in some ways, pretty good elephant. I mean, 70 years since an army has crossed the Rhine in anger. I don't know. I'm not a good enough medieval historian to tell you when the last time that was. But that is a really very long time compared to the time since the 30 Years' War. Our first great continent-wide paroxysm of murder.
Unfortunately, we cannot control any country, including Germany, when they become economically very powerful. Again, even if we don't like it, as long as paying my bills, maybe they have a right to tell me how to run my life, which is very unfortunate. And That's what it is, because it's one of the stronger countries in Europe. So they have that economic power. And I think we do the same thing as an American abroad, don't we? Yeah.
So we have another question from a texter that I'd like to pose. In the context is the title of the panel is "The EU Sings Breaking Up is Hard to Do." We've used the relationship metaphor, and we're talking about the possibility of breaking up, but what about the possibilities of making the leap and ending this long, period of betrothal and actually making it permanent? We have a question from a texter that asks, did leaving so much power in the hands of individual countries within the EU lead to lower cohesion and a lower sense of belonging among the populace? And I guess my gloss on the question would be, what are the prospects, rather than breaking up, of moving forward? If we're in a disequilibrium with the sort of half measures and incremental moves that have been taken so far, what about taking the big leap toward deeper integration, toward a United States of Europe?
I think partly, I'll go ahead, because this is where I was trying to get to at the end of my initial remarks. Part of the project is actually about finding a way to be that isn't solely defined on the national level. Part of it is about finding an alternative to either abolishing the nation state or being just in a bigger nation state. I mean, it's, this is felt very strongly, I think, on the left in politics. There's a wonderful line in Ernest Gellner's book about nations and nationalism, about the disappointment on the European left when the angel of history, which was meant to bring this great gift of understanding and solidarity to the classes of Europe, brought it to the nations instead through some sort of like post office mistake. And everyone sort of identifying as a nation, not as class. And there is a profound disquiet with nationalism in parts of Europe for very obvious historical reasons, which it's not obvious that you can assuage just by trying to become a bigger nation. A confederation, perhaps, rather than a federation. I don't know, but I think that the question is, we don't know what the end point of the ever closer union is. Most of us, though, see Europe as one of our identities, not as our only identity. There are few people who identify really strongly as European to an extent of not identifying at all with a national identity within that.
I think for true European integration to complete, The Economist actually writes quite eloquently on this. One of the things that is absent is the formation of joint European debt. So there are essentially no European bonds. So when the United States issues debt, it's being issued on behalf of all 50 states. Okay, that doesn't exist in Europe. There is no such thing as European debt. There's French debt, there's Greek debt, there's British debt, and this causes a lot of problems. This is actually part of the reason the euro crisis is ongoing. That has to be fixed. Another thing is there needs to be some sort of European-wide social safety net, which also does not exist. Each country is responsible for its own Medicare program, Social Security. They don't call them that there, but it's similar programs. My grandmother-in-law, she receives something like 1,000 zloty per month, which is about $250 per month to live on. And that's it. That's her sole source of income. That is difficult to maintain in a European continent where the pensions in the UK are much higher. And that's why you see immigration flowing from the Eastern Bloc to the richer Western countries, because their social safety net's bigger and better. And so there has to be some way of redistributing the wealth. I know that's not a comment. That's not a happy thing to say in this country. But there has to be some sort of way to redistribute European wealth in a way that will satisfy the immigration problem and that will satisfy other fiscal problems, because there is no federation of Europe.
Yeah, to piggyback to what my colleague said, I think it's very clear to me the governments in Europe currently are struggling, to come up with the collective decisions. And I believe in order for EU to survive, Europe needs to become more federal. The question is, how much more? And I don't see any other way. And I think the burden sharing, I think, is a very important factor. And I agree with what my colleague said. We've got to come up with a safety net that is going to treat all the countries exactly the same.
any questions from the audience? Don't be shy. The CWA audience being so shy. I'm shocked. We have one coming
Here
up
comes
now.
some non-shy people.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, what you just said just made me think about, so when people talked about Grexit, Greece possibly leaving the European Union, that might create a domino effect or set a precedent for other countries to believe that they can somehow default at some point and also leave. So if closer integration occurs and there's some people who decide they want to opt out, how are they not setting a precedent that becomes that domino effect and creates the dissolution of the entire union?
And I would just say the economist Charlemagne last week wrote that if the British vote to leave, the EU is really going to put the screws to them precisely to dissuade future possible exits.
Yeah, I mean, and we saw something actually slightly similar on a slightly different scale, where when Scotland was voting on whether to leave the United Kingdom, but the Scots would all wish, if they were to do so, to stay in the European Union. Something similar happening in a slightly different way in the Spanish were being very, very clear that if they left the European Union, they left. If they left Britain, if they left the United Kingdom, they left the European Union too, and that was a very clear message to secessionists in Spain. So yes, everyone plays these games. I don't think that in general it's necessarily always going to be a bad thing if some nations wish to leave the European Union. I just don't want mine to do it now because I don't think it makes sense for us. But going back to this earlier question, it is very distressing to see how the debate in Britain is being structured over whether you will be better or worse off financially in a matter of sort of like 2 to 5 years. Partly because, with the greatest deference to my colleagues in that great calling, the ability of economists to actually tell you what the GDP is going to be, GDP growth figure is going to be like in 5 years, even if nothing changes, are pretty poor. But also because this is a decision about what sort of a nation we are, what sort of people we are. It's really not something to make on the basis of whether it will marginally affect your income for the next couple of years. But that's the level of debate that we currently have.
I agree with Oliver that it doesn't really particularly matter if some of the countries in the European Union decide to leave. If Greece left, arguably European Union might be better off. If the UK left, I think it won't be better off, but I think that the European Union will go on. But there are some countries that I think if they left, it would be the end of the European Union. And if France left, the European Union's over. If Germany leaves, it's over. Okay, and so there are some keystone countries that cannot leave.
Yeah, Germany, in a sense, can't leave because it would actually sort of like be Europe leaving itself. there's a question of who's what there.
Very good. So we'll come over to this side. Yes, ma'am.
I'm thinking about with the European Union and thinking about nations versus cultures. And I think it's, when I think of Europe, I think about all the wonderful things about all the different cultures of each country that I would want to still hope would maintain even if they unified. And I'm thinking about, but that versus the problem of some of all the immigrants coming in and not assimilating, like what happened in Brussels and that kind of thing. Could that be part of the solution, figuring out a way to assimilate without losing their cultural heritages that people appreciate? And, I'm thinking of Americans, we do have a lot of immigrants that assimilate, and then we come and we want to go to all the restaurants that are here and that kind of thing. And could the same thing happen in Europe without identifying as nations, but maintaining cultural, I don't know how to word this, but you know what I'm saying, without, separating people so much that they feel like they're in their own neighborhood in a bad way.
Mm-hmm.
Well, at the risk of being booed by the audience as an immigrant, I think it's important for us, when we decided to come and live in a country permanently and become a productive member of a society, we do not cherry pick. We need to adjust. And I think it's very critical. I know, I have friends, colleagues, that they say, we need to keep our identity in this country, our culture, our language, our religion. I think we can do all of this and become part of this country. I don't think those issues are mutually exclusive. And I see as an immigrant, the big difference between the immigrant that come to this country and the immigrant, they go to Europe. Because if you don't want to make any adjustment, if you have no respect for the culture, I'm not talking about religion, I'm talking about the culture, then why did you decide to move to this particular country? Why didn't you stay at home? And I know that's the harsh thing to say, but I'm saying it as an immigrant, as someone to experience. In order for us to succeed, we gotta speak the language, we gotta understand the system, and we gotta make some adjustment. And I tell, some people, you invite me to your house, or I invite you as a Persian or as Iranian to my house. Part of a culture, you have to take your shoes off. You might not like it, but you have to respect my culture.
Yeah, when my grandparents came from the Soviet Union, they came as refugees. They were kidnapped by the Germans and taken to World War II, and taken to Germany during World War II. And when they came to the United States, they did not teach anyone in their family to speak Russian, because they said, we are now Americans, we're not Russian. Of course, they said, we are not we are not Russians now. And so it was less effective, but that was definitely their viewpoint, was 100% assimilation. And I think you can assimilate while retaining your cultural heritage, but it's important to do both.
That's right.
Okay, yes, sir.
Yes, I would just like to ask if tomorrow or a week or so, the European Union just broke down and we went back to the French having the franc and everything was back to when I was younger. What do you think would be the result immediately? Would there be a recession? Would there be a banking crisis? Would nothing happen? What is your opinion if just broke up completely?
The first two, recession and banking crisis.
Yeah, I don't understand. I don't really understand the substrate of the question, because that only happens as a result of a crisis. So it's not. I don't quite understand if the European Union, it's not just going to go away like that. But yeah, recession. And then I think, frankly, about a week later, people start working out how to rebuild a European Union and do it better this time.
Which is what is happening now in Balkans.
Yeah, that's true. But also, it's really, if we go back, the French goes to franc, and we go back to our original currency, that causes a lot of uncertainty. For example, how are we going to determine the value of our currency compared to dollar? That causes a lot of financial crisis. And I'm not even going to mention what is going to happen to the stock market.
Very good.
So
yes,
yeah,
sir.
One of the problems with the EU that was mentioned was that a lot of Europeans don't feel that the EU is democratic because only the parliament's elected and a lot of officials are appointed by diktat. And I'm wondering if the panelists have any ideas for how the EU can become more democratic.
Maybe as Bernie Sanders keeps saying, we need political revolution.
Probably have elections to the European Commission and elections to some of the governing bodies that they currently don't. I think that's the only way you could do it.
Makes sense. There's a line from a British Prime Minister of the 1930s about the danger of politicians who enjoy the prerogative of the harlot throughout history, power without responsibility. And that's something of how people feel about the European Parliament. The problem is the European Parliament isn't a very nice idea in principle until you actually deal with the European Parliament, and then you realize that it really is a pretty rum bunch of people in many ways. The problem is that it only gets better if you give it more responsibility. At the same time, if you give it more responsibility, it will go on doing the sort of things that the European Parliament does, which is get hopelessly enamored with particular lobby groups that have got very good at dealing with it. I think a second chamber for the European Parliament. I think some sort of bicameral system might be a way to go. Some sort of revising and something a bit like the Bundesrat in Germany might be some way to go. A sense in which there could be a sense of some sort of like oversight. But the seat of power in Europe is going to be the Council for the foreseeable future.
And if you want to read some particularly fun screeds against the European Union, you should follow Daniel Hannan on Twitter. He's a British European member of Parliament who absolutely hates the Parliament of the European Union.
So I see three folks here at the microphone. We're coming short on time, so I'll go ahead and invite all three of you to pose your questions, and then we'll give the panelists a last word. So yes, sir.
Thank you. I was hoping that one or many of you could comment on, in the event if the UK or any other state does leave the European Union and a replacement state would be added, for example, Turkey, what would the implications be in terms of relations between Russia and the rest of the Islamic world?
Okay, so thank you for that one, and we'll go ahead and come over here. Yes, sir.
My first question is to the Balkan expert, Mr. Serja. So, what would
I'm
Balkan
everything but.
what would Balkan expansion into the EU mean for the European Union and for the Balkan countries? And my second question is to Mr. Ramazani. You mentioned that Mr. Obama will be remembered as one of the best presidents.
I didn't say best.
Oh, one of the better ones, yeah. And domestically, that's certainly the case. But what about domestically? That's certainly the case. But what about the campaign that he has carried out, the drone assassination campaign? So if you could comment on that.
Mm-hmm. And then, ma'am, yes, ma'am.
Yes. Europe has a long and inglorious history of warring among each other, and as you pointed out, that some of this has been punctured or made easier by the European Union. If indeed the European Union fell apart, have they been talking long enough to keep those wars from happening again, or would we soon have European nations fighting with each other again in the guns and violent sense?
Wonderful question. So I'd like to just give each panelist a last opportunity. So it looks like you're ready to roll, so please go ahead.
I can actually
we'll go down the line.
I can quickly answer your question. The European Union is not Mr. Potato Head, so it's not like you can't just swap out one country and put in another one, right? So if the United Kingdom chose to leave, that doesn't give a fast track to Turkey. Turkey's got a lot of issues that it needs to resolve. So if the UK left, then we're down to 27 members for the time being.
Mm-hmm. Very good.
I want to come in on that last question. No, I don't think that we're going to go back among the large European nations, I don't think we're going to go back to fighting large international wars, but I also don't want to take the chance. I think we genuinely do. We are genuinely more likely to find a better way to deal with the challenges of the 21st and 22nd century by trying to find some post-national solution to how to govern a country which, as you say, has driven warfare and imperialism across the globe for 3 centuries.
For Balkans, on which I'm nothing but the expert, I'm anything else. But I think Balkans will be the part of the European Union, and I think it should be encouraged faster because, we are these ridiculous people who broke out the beautiful big country of Yugoslavia, fought 10 years of ridiculous wars, only to end up as the best neighbors in terms of who is trading with whom. So it's a joint market already, and the treaties were signed and the countries were going there, and I think the Balkans would be the part of the European Union. It's a tricky question whether or not all the countries will be in NATO. For example, my country, I don't think it should go to NATO or it will be at NATO at any point. But from the security point of view, one is stability. Balkan will be more stable. From security point of view, Balkan in NATO doesn't make a lot of sense because everything else is surrounded by the NATO already. So, stabilizing it for a long term, it would be good to have it in European Union.
And every expansion of NATO tends to irritate one Mr. Vladimir Putin.
Yeah.
Reza.
And why, during my talk, I said people in this country, and I'm sure other countries, are going to judge Obama administration, I think, fairly. The history is going to judge him fairly, and I think everything is relative. I'm an old man. I have gone through a lot of experience, talking about the political situation in the Middle East, especially what role the CIA play in politics in Iran, when we nationalize our national oil. And in real life, everything is relative. I compare this president and his political decision-making or political policy based on the previous administration. And I think that's a fair comparison. And of course, I am biased. And as an Iranian who doesn't have that much love for the current regime, I was so pleased the way he distinguished between Iranian people and Iranian government. That the fact every Persian New Year, which was just last week, to send a message to Iranian people, quoting a Persian poem, talk about the Persian food, is a fresh air to me, to someone who has been in this country since 1977, and the only thing I hear about Iran is all bad things. So, yes, it is important for us to distinguish between the Ayatollahs and Iranian, but I have 4 brothers, I have a family in Iran, and I know how delighted they are to see that the relationship between this country and my beloved country improve, and one day I am able to go home and visit my family without any fear. And I think that's an important contribution, and we shouldn't forget. And this is coming from a goofy economist who measures everything in monetary terms.
On that happy note,
I'd also like to say how impressed I am.
we are out of time. We will call a close to the panel. Thank you all very much. And thank you, panelists.
Thank you so much. It was great. Lovely so much. Thank you. This was great.